gospel almost invites me to do a 3-hour doctoral seminar on Beelzebul or demons. But I don't know whether anyone these days needs to give a seminar on demons when we see the awful evil that exists in the news these days. So instead, let us turn from the darkness and meditate for a bit on John de Lalande. There's a lot we don't know about St. John de Lalande, the youngest of the North American martyrs. We think he was in the first years of his 20s when he was martyred. But we have no evidence of the date of his birth. We know he came from Dieppe, the largest seaport in 17th century France, right there at the edge of Normandy. In fact, today there's a shuttle that goes back. But we do not know whether he was baptized in the church of Saint-Jacques or Saint-Remy. Even his death is shrouded in mystery, having been reported more than a year after it happened, with only third-hand accounts. Neither his body nor that of his mentor, Father Isaac Jogues, have ever been surely recovered. There's a lot we don't know about him. What we do know is he was born in the largest seaport of France at a time when the foreign policy of that king was dominated by a competition with his English neighbor, some things never change, for exploitation of the new world across the sea. John was probably in grammar school when he witnessed 300 brave souls setting off for New France, centered around present-day Quebec. Perhaps he stood on those pebbled beaches by the 15th century castle that dominates the shore and gazed across the horizon with childhood dreams of a new world racing through his life. In a few years, the Jesuit Father Isaac Jogues departed from Dieppe for New France, where with his Jesuit brother René Gopal, he would work among the Hurons, the Iroquois, and the Mohawk Indians. Gopal was a surgeon, and he would tend to the sick while Jogues would, in his own words, and I quote from him, labor there for the conversion and welfare of the natives. Soon, however, word would have trickled back to young John back in Dieppe of the heroic work of the Jesuits of New France and of the tragic events of 1642. Remember, he's still a teenager. When Father Jogues and Brother René were caught up in a local dispute among the Hurons. With a seashell, they hacked off the fingers which Father Jogues would use to say Mass, and killed his young servant assistant, the first of the North American martyrs to die. One can only imagine the desire of the teenage Lalande upon hearing these tales to give his life as a martyr for Christ and for the gospel. One can also reasonably imagine that when the beaten and mutilated Father Jogues returned to France some months later, it would have been through Dieppe, and the young John might have been standing there on the pier, maybe even getting to meet him. Within a year, incredibly, Father Jogues decided to return to the missions, along with a special commission to continue celebrating the Mass with his mutilated hands. We don't know exactly when John Lalande traveled to New France, but scholars suppose he was about 19 years old, inscripted as a donné, that is a special lay assistant, not quite a brother, to the Jesuit missionaries. In any case, he was assigned to be assistant and chief traveling companion of the great Father Jogues, who had volunteered to return to Iroquois territory in order to negotiate a peace with the Hurons and the Mohawks on behalf of New France. From the moment they set out, however, and were among the native tribes, the suspicions of those who had first tried to stop Father Jogues from saying Mass by cutting off his Mass fingers, those suspicions once again came to the fore. Fearing that foreign magic had caused their most recent crop failures, they were particularly focused on destroying the box in which the priest and his companion kept the chalice for Mass. It was a magic box, and if they could destroy it, then this evil practitioner of foreign magic would be helpless to hurt. This, combined with the reality that when the missionaries arrived in native villages, they inadvertently brought along smallpox and measles, the COVID-19 of the day, diseases for which the native communities had little immunity. The mysterious fatalities that resulted every time that Jogues and Lalande visited a village were seen as another sign of the dark presence they brought. And so on the 18th of October, in 1646, the Mohawks put a tomahawk into Father Jogues' head and threw his body into the Mohawk River along with his magic box. The next day, as the young Donnet attempted to retrieve his mentor's body, he too was martyred and his body thrown into the river. One more thing that we do know about this young lay martyr. While he was growing up in Dieppe, the most popular religious journal was called the Jesuit Relations. It often reflected on the dangers of the missions to the native peoples of New France. And we can imagine this young kid sitting there, reading romantic articles on the joys of martyrdom, of giving one's life for Christ in the New World. Repeatedly, the journal would revel in accounts of welcoming the suffering of martyrdom, like the saints of the earliest days of the church did. For in martyrdom, one was deemed worthy to join your sufferings to the redemptive sufferings of Christ upon the cross. As the first Jesuit superior to North America wrote in one such article, considering the glory that God receives from the sacrifice of the martyrs whose blood waters the earth throughout the world, it would seem a curse if our part of the world should not participate in the happiness of having contributed to this splendor of God's glory. And a final peek into the heart of Saint Jean de Lelong. Among those priests the young lay martyr would have met when he was living in Quebec before he and Jogues set out was Father Jean de Brebeuf, who would be similarly martyred 3 years later as the last of the Jesuit martyrs. And so when you read the words of Jean de Brebeuf, written in that same French journal, you can almost hear the voice of Jean de Lalande, the young boy who gave his life for Christ and the missions. He wrote, "I make a vow to you, never to fail in the face of martyrdom. If by your infinite mercy, Lord, you offer it to me someday, to me, your unworthy servant, My beloved Jesus, I offer to you from today my blood, my body, and my life. All I want is to be able to die for you. These are the words of the martyrs, the patrons of this church, upon which your church sits. Saint John de Levant, pray for us.